Good afternoon to everyone here. This afternoon I'm going to briefly share some thoughts about the protection of traditional culture and the natural environment in Tibet. So, in general, out of the various parts of the world, the south, the north, the middle part of it, Tibet is considered a very important place. That's something everyone is probably aware of. So the landscape of Tibet, or Tibet as a place, is not something with environmental significance just for itself, but also in terms of weather and water, etc., for many areas of the world. However, in recent years, a lot of changes have taken place in the environment in Tibet. The picture behind me is from a Tibetan area in Sichuan province. 50 years ago, there was no dry land or sandy desert like you can see in the photo. So the sandy area that existed back then was not like the one in the picture. It was much smaller. And within the space of 50 years, great changes have taken place, and now the desert area is very large. And examples like this, there are many examples or situations like this. For example, there were many snow mountains or snow-covered mountains. So over the past 10 or 15 years, there have been certain people with a particular interest in the environment who have been monitoring changes that have taken place, looking at the changes particularly in these alpinous mountain areas and documenting the changes on a yearly basis.
15
years ago, then the tops of these mountains were white. They were covered in snow. And then, but since then, the changes that have been taking place year after year are something that these groups of people are paying attention to and documenting. And so there are many examples where mountains that were once upon a time covered in snow and white have now lost a lot of snow coverage and appear to be black. And there are many mountains that traditionally had many lakes around them.
티 가시도 드니 가서 보바가 있나 때라 내르세 그래 티토람 초가세요 덴리트소도 드니 나마니디 익찰로 야니가 공네 티토라 토잡네 드니 이게 드니 요리스.
Many of these mountains were important pilgrimage sites, and so there were clear records, in fact, of the number of lakes around them and their geographical characteristics.
드니 딘디엔 송디 드니 아마 드니 다 대당 마라 티 초총총도 소마르 제총 제용 송네 초 망보 메파레네 다 아마이 남초 섬잔다 보든지 요사이나 다다 잔다 드니 마토바 메파든지 차요레스.
And there are cases of where once upon a time there were 300 or so lakes around these pilgrimage sites or mountains, whereas now there are only 100. There are many cases of this kind of decline in the number of lakes.
든지 엔디 드니 토르강 같으니 남시 때 드니 하마다 만자와 하정 같으니 여러 침보드니 로요아테 코소 뭐 가르게소 드니 멋이 강가나라 당아서 로자니비아 든지 돈덕 마레 코소 멋이 강가나라 여러 할리파 망보 송요아테 코소 무크타나 드니 하고 요레.
And the changes in the climate of the Tibetan plateau was something that elder generations of Tibetans are very clear about and often talk about. These are not changes that have taken place over a period of 100 years. These are changes that have taken place in the short span of their own lifetimes.
드니 엔디 드니 다 대랑아초 코릭 대라더니 주 dakchung시야다 소 드니 망보고 드니 돈낭시게 요레스.
So on account of this, there are many people who are concerned for the plight of the environment.
드니 티나라 드니 돈낭신켄테 소나라 잠발랑 드니 주 잠바가 드니 사샤가 드니 돈낭시된 컨텐디양 요리스.
And there are, of course, people in other parts of the world who are also very concerned about this.
드니 중국어 낭라 드니 촉바갈라 간섬 드니 야르보바가 사찰란조니 딱시시 드니 시된 그냥 두스.
And there are organizations and groups in China, inside China, who also undertake trips to Tibet to research the changes that are taking place in the state of the environment.
드니 보바가 낭라양 드니 다 뭐 카시카시 드니 디톨라 돈낭시니 디톨라 레칼렌 컨텐디 요레스.
And there are a few people also inside Tibet who are paying attention to these issues and working on them.
드니 다 코리코 돌아든지 여러 망보즈더니 로요아테 드니 달로 카시더니 로 납치트치 다든지 나로라 레마토 바더니 스토징거 돌아 가마이나 든지 여러 망보 연구만두스.
So these big changes that we're seeing is something that's really taken place in the last 50 or 60 years. Traditionally speaking, the Tibetan landscape has not seen such great changes.
든지 인디 담보 드니 가서 보거든이 르그니 나라 요파 나마거든이 르그니 냥바가 나라 요피더니 코리 종줍고 거거든이 따와 고소고 따와다 고소고 삼로된 대중 모투시게인지.
So I'm going to introduce to you now the traditional attitude and the traditional view that Tibetan culture held towards the natural environment and its protection.
드니 나마티니 과랑초고더니 보거든이 르그종다 드니 추나라 드니 코리거든이 거거든이 따와만보 셴두스.
Traditionally speaking, there is a lot of commentary on the environment in traditional Tibetan culture and the religious tradition.
드니 코초양 드니 나마 르그종티 나라 드니 다 코릭텔라 드니 잡잡체고레즈니 드니 거드니 코릭텔라 쯔종 진족약 보시고야다 드니 잡잡체고야다 종교시고야 드니 건다가 가자 망보 나마가 드니 종토소나라 요레즈.
And these traditional cultural sources said a lot or advocated the importance of protecting the environment, respecting the environment, and being cautious with one's exploitation of it.
드니 오나 코초 드니다 코리글라 드니 잡잡체고레 제와 드니 김슨드 드니 따와드 강레레즈나 드니 따와드 모투체겐스.
And the reason, the view behind their advocacy of protecting the environment is something I'd like to talk about now.
드니 담보데 코랑초제나 드니 다 코릭티 토랑아서 되니 더 멋지고 마찬가지 되니 샘진 망보 되니 더 코릭티 토라 치나라이나자 릉고라이나자 되니 나카나라이나자 샘진 망보요래 대요나 되니 코릭티라 토락시나 되니 샘진 티서 정말라 노파렌조레네 되니 토락시냐가 말이지 대코서 따와시그레스.
So the first view behind the need to protect the environment was based on the notion that the environment is comprised of not only human beings but also all manner of other beings in the woods, in the water, and that by destroying this habitat, it brings harm to all manner, myriad kinds of living beings.
되니 다상아츠 되니 통화가 되니 잡버는데 되니 더 스촨가 되니 보바가 사차가 되니 캄바가 사차가 곰바치가 코리그레스.
The landscape in the picture here is from the surrounding area of a monastery in Kham.
되니 니 나라요 바가 낙텔라 되니 로지자요 코소고 낙더 샹동더 되니 코소고 할레바가 데람 통칭셰 근도즈 곰바티.
The monastery, the community regards this tree in this picture as extremely important.
그 코랑소 라마다 되니 코랑소 잡아차고 제나 되니 늘라 돌락시냐가 말해제니 코소고 베티님 통칭셰고 요레스니 낙텔라.
So the lamas and monks at the monastery forbid harming or destroying this tree.
디 김선 가레제나 되니 더다니 샹동 디 토라 되니 가서 되니 묶음 통야가 되니 쪽쪽대지 침보 거와 되니 나갑 든겟 되니 디 토라 되니 네입자닌 등두스.
And the reason that they value this tree so much is that just in terms of the kinds of life form that we can, see with our naked eyes, there's probably 7 or 8 different types.
니톨라테니 쪽짝테니 샤당 시당 뜻소 샤시테니 나가 카시즌 도진디나라.
There are different, several varieties of birds, for example.
테니 데 마임비테니 다 쪽짝 총총 야가 송수지지 던지가 거라양 디톨란도스.
And smaller kinds of animals like squirrels.
테니 던지엔디 테니 다 거랑초제나 테니 샹동 드테니 토르식단에 메바체자나 테니 다 쪽쪽 덤자자가 릭든디 또 나카든디 mam보도 요래 또 상마든디 득사 아더니 코소드님 참문디 나라요네 테니 참만디 돌아 되게 요래 테나 코소 은득사도 메파린저 오래 데인딘도 총접시고 레진네 코소든디 세근도스.
And the reason that they forbid the destruction of this tree is that by doing so, the habitats, the living spaces, the homes of hundreds of different types of living beings would be destroyed if this happened.
덴디인디 데니 코초 삼로타나 데니 쪽착 데니 잠님 쪽착 잠님 데니 체쪽라 지치시바 대당 데니 코리 쪽쪽시바 니보데라 코초나 할레바금 레와 침보요바 덴디 통고요레스.
So for them, the view that sees all living beings as equal and equality between all living beings is very closely related to their need they perceive for the protection of the environment.
덴디엔디 데니 더 코소 데니 다 코리 쪽쪽데 시고야 김선데 마시나 돌락시나 샘진 망볼라 노파체레 디 김선진 아송 코리 쪽쪽시고 레제아테 코소 따와 당보레스.
So their first view or their first reason for considering the protection of the environment very important is that by destroying it, the living habitats and the lives of many different beings would be destroyed and harmed.
데니 니바드 가레제나 데니 따와 니바드 코랑 소제나 데니 당아초 데니 직팅 그 감제나 당아초 데니 직팅 디나라 나랑초 묶음 통야 그데니 다 게담 제어 그데니 제와 베나가초 사원 살라답나 메토코 사원 살라답나 데니 메토코 사원 야르키 용와타 데니 가초 묶음 통나 데니 통 촉바 데니 가초 락바가라나 락촉바 데니 김제금 제와 찌겨레스.
And then the second reason underlying the view, the necessity of protecting the environment, is the idea that in terms of our worldly life, we can perceive the law of cause and effect as it plays out in things that our eye can see. So, for example, one plants a seed and a flower a flower grows. That there is a law of cause and effect of action and consequence that we can perceive with our own eyes.
Teni yang teli jampi tini ta yang jedam jewa tini jewa chigi ore te nga so mukum thong mare nawa ga tiko mare lakpa ga raga yang yo mare ta yinda tini te khorang ga tini jiti jewa tini jimje te tini yang khorang tini ta khorang ne opa yongkhen ga tini zres.
At the same time, though, there is also another kind of cause and effect or action and consequence that is not something that we can perceive with our own naked eye or touch with our own hand. It's an intangible law of cause and effect.
Teni indi khorang so samlo tamba na teni nga so khorik tela teni ta chu sada chida shangdan de so la teni no pa shina teni ngus nga so teni ta chu pe na chilo yong ya da o ta teni yong ya te mayin ba teli jamba ga teni nga so mukum thong ma tha pa lak pa ra ma tha pa teni ga jimje ga tobni teni yang no pa mambo mala teni no pa mambo yong gore samne ko so teni sam de se.
So based on this, people feel that in addition to the negative environmental effects that would take place as a result from destroying the environment, there would also be all manner of potential other kinds of unseen or intangible negative effects that would be wrought on humans as a result of destroying the natural environment.
The Quran so sambai na pe na chi na teni ta ja teni ringo yen na ja shang yen na ja khorang rang shong kham gun na la teni ze zhib yo pa te la te khola nilik dan dan zi yo re te yo na teni chi pa gir se gir she an da o ta ri teni ma ra tor ya da o ta shang cha pa da o teni she ja na teni nga cho mukum thong yi no pa te ma yim ba teni mukum mong thong wa ga teni ta no pa yong gre sam ne kho zo te la yi chi she ndu se.
So the view really holds that things like mountains and rivers and forests, etc., their very existence on the earth is in accordance with the natural way of things, and on this account, it's not appropriate for their the way that they exist to be tampered with or interfered with by humans. And in fact, if this does take place, then in addition to the obvious effects of interfering with the natural environment, there are potentially all manner of other negative, harmful results that may take place as well.
Teni chokchak jamba yen nan ja tada rangshung kam ni pote teni pansang chik la tin ne ne ba zere samne ko so teni sam go yores.
And so their view is that humans and the natural environment in fact exist in a relationship of intimate interconnection.
Teni nga cho jikting ka kam la yo pa ga jimre sama teni nga cho mukum thong ya tak tak mare ze nga cho mukum mam thong wa jedam re teni yang mambo zo nguni tani tong go thola yores.
So in terms of this world, there is, of course, the law of cause and effect where we can see the effects with our own eye. There's something we can readily perceive, but at the same time, too, there are all kinds of intangible ways that that cause and effect also operate. For example, sound waves, etc. These are things that we cannot see and we cannot hear, and yet we know that they operate.
Teni pena kokir ko ngupo ta kokir ke nipa taware se an wu zhe an neng liang hui na te taware te so tamche po yo yo re te ina ngarang so muko tong ko yo mares.
And for example, dark matter, dark materials, for example, these are things that science holds exists, but they're not something that we can perceive with our own eyes.
Teni ngarang so teni ta wangbo ngarang so mukta nawa ta so ina te nga so chowa ga nang la teni pesho tang ya teni zam ma to ba njikting ge nguni chang ni nilik chen li zina nilik ngoma teni ta chor go na teni ko chor tham khang ge teni zre mendu nga so wangbo te so.
And in fact, our senses, our sensorial perception is really only able to perceive things that are of immediate use to us in our everyday lives. But in terms of being able to see and perceive the fundamental or the truth of or essence of the world and the way it operates, our senses are not equipped to do this.
Teni boba ga rigni ga nang la teni khoso ti tinja vi teni muk mang thong wa da na wa ga ma thu wa ga teni te so ga teni jimje te la khoso ha lepa yichi she ga yores.
However, in traditional Tibetan culture, there was a very strong belief in the existence of effects of actions that are in fact not able to be seen with the eye or heard with the ear, these intangible kinds of relationships. And so the second reason underpinning the traditional Tibetan belief in the necessity of protecting the environment was based on this.
And then
the third reason underpinning the necessity of protecting the environment was the reverence and respect that Tibetans traditionally held towards the natural environment. And this respect and reverence was really based on two main reasons. One reason was that, for example, many mountains in Tibetan areas were regarded as sacred in nature, and on that basis, different from other places and were respected on this basis.
Tani drama koranga metok nani drangsti korang thongore na metok tela korang ka torshi sheg mareze tindi shena tini ta tarta maung bana yang tini korang lojima yang tarong metok nani tarong yang ne yang de korang ka tini metok nani drangsti thong thap kore ina metok ta mepa she jona tini drangsti thong thap ka mare te na no pa shi nyang ka mare samne ko tindi sam gan dos.
And then the second reason was just as a bee who drinks honey or nectar from the flower without destroying the flower can therefore come back to the flower year after year and continue to make use of the flower, so too humans should exist in a relationship with the environment where they can continually make use of it without destroying it.
Perna boba rigne ga nangla teni rangshong kam drjong zeke zhengfu da zran zeke teni ge tsig de zawan ne be shi she ge mares.
In the Tibetan, traditional Tibetan parlance, it was never spoken of the need to surmount or conquer nature.
Teni ngaso nofshog inanda, kharshog inanda, yang rigne mambo nangla teni rangshong kam drjong she ge zhengfu da zran teni zeke tsig mambo be shi tang ge yores.
In other world traditions, in the West and in the East too, there's a lot of, it's often spoken of the need to conquer or tame nature.
Penangama tini ta Himalaya tini Jomolama fong Jomolama re thola tini boba zarni korang tini ta ringola tini clipsongwares.
In the past, there have been Tibetans who have reached the peak of Mount Everest.
Yang ato yerko tunchumla nongkanda tini makashi tini yang Jomolama tini ti ogukla tini ta koso garjapsa tini yore tilandone kochi tamoz tani tini share par koso paila longdo yores.
Among tourists, though, there are a lot of people who go to the base of Mount Everest and take in the sights there, and then they return to their various home places.
Teni korang tsonguni tranishana Jomolama thola tsawani songyo marta makashi ga yang o teni ko Jomolama ko zhengfu Jomolama fongzini teni ge kajashen teni zenken yores.
However, despite the fact that they didn't reach the top of Mount Everest, they nevertheless talk about having conquered or subdued Mount Everest.
Teni bobastik teni ko teni Jomolama ga teni gola songne teni to ko ringola songne teni marion ne kabna teni sargut pa ga teni khola teni chandshi wares.
The Tibetan who climbed to the peak of Mount Everest, upon returning to the bottom, was interviewed by a journalist.
Teni sargut pa khola kari tigrezena ta tari Jomolama ga teni gola songne teni kyorang ga Jomolama ndrjong she bare ta zhengfu Jomolama fong teni re ta kyorang ga semla chora kandin dozene khola teni jin doze.
And the journalist asked him, so having surmounted Mount Everest, having reached the peak, what kind of feeling do you have?
Then 코랑 그제나 딘지 좀 조모랑 만들어준 게 딘지 소라 콜라 짜와네미 코랑데 삼바메 나랑이나 데니 조모라마 데니 나랑 장라 데니 다 코랑금 착바가 토라 데니 용네 데니 잠발랑라 데니 타모타야가 딘지 코르코즈 잡바데 니 코랑라 과든 제요 마토바 니 드르중 제가 메제 코랑 딘지 람두스.
What he did answer was, I don't have any feeling that I've in any way surmounted or, conquered Mount Everest. The fact that Mount Everest gave me the opportunity to stand on its shoulders and look down at the world from there is something to which I feel gratitude towards the mountain, not any feeling of having conquered it.
데니 데 코랑 데니 다 셔탕거 보바가 데니 삼로즈리 나마 쪼르징거 나라이나 데니 랑숑 감텔라나 코소 데니 다 데 긴지크 삼로 콜라 랑숑 감텔라 기바단 직비티니 삼로 데니즈 요레 디점신기 데니레 코소고 데니 더종시 정부라고 데니 제가 말했어.
So this kind of attitude is typical of the traditional Tibetan attitude towards the natural environment. The traditional viewpoint was not one where the natural landscape was seen as something that needed to be conquered or subdued.
덴지 인디 데니 코초고 데니 쪼르징 그 토라 나만라이나 데니 코초고 데니 저 거리 그 토라 데니 다 보그 사찰라 데니 네네 로 동창만보 츠창만보 데니 네레다 이나 데니 거리 그 토라 노바 만보 토라 만보 제야다 데니 시요 말이지.
So despite the fact that the Tibetan people or the Tibetan civilization has been living on the plateau for thousands of years, historically speaking, no great destruction occurred in the natural environment during this time.
데니 다 옛나티니 당아서 니처티니 더다 코리고 남식은 잠불랑 그때니 남실란 게라서 위티 gemsen지 때니 게라 만본도고 요레스.
However, in recent years, what with climate change in the world at large, many changes are taking place in the natural environment in Tibet.
데니 데 코랑 초고 데니 쪼르징 그때니 삼로 더제고나 코랑 초고 데니 더 나마가 탑시 더다 종접 시탑고요 말했던 잠발로 야치슈 그때니 더 여러와즈레 고소 때라 탑시요 말했.
So in light of these really large-scale changes that are taking place and in the context of the world at large too, these traditional attitudes or traditional means of protecting the environment are inadequate.
데니 코리 따따티니 가서 사마하고 와들이 코리 끝났던제와 때된 잠발랑 그 망보고 삼로 땅야 같은데 나톤 할리바 치슈치그린두스.
So the need for environmental protection is something that has become a key issue and cause of concern in the world at large.
데니 따티 나톤데 강지고니 타추셰고레 제니테니 총도 망본 소코요레 망보고 삼로 망보 땅요레 돌랑 망보 제요레.
And how to go about addressing this problem is something that meetings are convened to discuss all the time. There's so many large-scale discussions of this topic.
데니 디 톨라테니 나라초 직데니 잠발랑 그 톨라페나 데니 탄용위 데니 다 딘초와 디탄 생활진 초와제 안라오다 데니 답디근 초와제 안라오다 다 데니 망보즈 데니 고사레즈니 망보 데니 샤컨데 우스.
So many people are saying that we need to have low carbon lifestyles and return to lifestyles of simplicity and advocating the need for these kinds of changes.
예나한테 나랑서한테 따르당아서 라티니 코릭다 데니가서 뭐 셈니께 발라다 가르바 할리바 침보직도 돈이 오레스.
However, there is now a big conflict in a way between humans and the natural environment.
양나가서 당럽 거르니 디나라 현대文明 온디나라 디니 할리바가 가라침보시 돈두스.
And this conflict has arisen within contemporary civilization.
디니 가라치도 강레지나 디니 가촌 잠발랑 것디니 또다 잠랑라 시킨 용큰 것디니 또다 로다 침보 초인난자 안도서 참마가나니 가리 디니 롭고 요리지나 로종 거 싸왕고 마튼 가촌 문남 그 노파치치란 조야가 탑시 딱딱 랍고 요리스.
And one of the reasons for this is because the kind of education that is being promoted in the world's universities these days is one that supports the ever-growing or ever-increasing fulfillment of desires of individuals.
데니 따로 가서 데니 노바든 가서 야르지선 조위더니 거시 그래지니 던지 양세가 요레스.
So we are in a situation where our desires are growing in force.
Teni nga tso teni longkor ka lam khana yo pin remda kwangao teni remda nja manja mambo zu teni nga tso ta teni nyamchen ga nang teni remda sarsho ko to lan remda tabshi nja manja mambo teni nga tso min dopa yar chechi la tong yo res.
And all kinds of advertisements that we see in the world around us, on the roadside, on television, in newspapers, whatever, all deploy various means to increase and fuel our desires.
So on
the one hand, people are saying that what we need is a return to simple lifestyles. However, on the other hand, if our desires are only increasing, then talking about things like low carbon lifestyles and simple lifestyles, we're never going to really realize these things. There's a conflict between these two ideas. So with the increase in people's desires, then what people long for are various luxurious lifestyles. If indeed we are going to lead low carbon lifestyles or simple lifestyles, then it's necessary for our desires to be controlled or reduced.
In
Western countries, many people have lifestyles that are, materially speaking, very affluent.
And
then among the less affluent and poorer people of the world, they look towards people who are leading these affluent lifestyles and strive for these things themselves. But if everyone on the earth is in fact to achieve these styles, this standard of living, then in terms of resources, we need perhaps 3 or 4 earths in order to fulfill these needs. So we don't have the number of the amount of resources to satisfy these desires. If we don't find a way to keep desires in check or rein them in, then all our talk of environmental protection will come to nothing. So while we're not saying that it is necessary for people to live with absolutely no desire whatsoever, without keeping it in check or keeping desires at a reasonable level, then there is really no hope that objectives of environmental protection will in fact be realized. There are many people who think the idea to keep one's desires in check or to reduce them is in fact an idea that is held by religious practitioners or religious types only, but in fact this isn't the case.
Teni samlundu tangbo teni chulukanani yongba yenang ja mayendang ja gangster tarta ngachu teni to ngbu thola teni mashina teni tam mandrik pa teni mayongwa teni kan samla thyorese machama.
In fact, regardless of whether or not this idea did originate in a religious tradition, if we don't put this idea into practice, then we are going to arrive at a very dangerous place.
So, in
terms of Khenpo's personal opinion, environmental protection really needs to proceed from the individual and the mind of the individual. However, in terms of contemporary culture, which doesn't emphasize this, then environmental protection or the measures that are taken, that are implemented, are only of very small impact. Of course, these measures that we do advocate, these temporary measures or external measures that are implemented, are not without any value entirely. So for many thousands of years, Tibetans have been advocating or have believed of the importance of protecting the natural environment. But in the current situation where the climate is becoming warmer and these changes are taking place, then from the Tibet there is nothing that they can do about it. This is now a problem of global proportions.
다 올랑에 되니 곰바서 되니 나서 조징거 르네가 되니 코리 총교라 되니 식진 되니 영어럽 거 되니 로직 하시스 되니 ngoto지gens.
And from here on in, I'm going to introduce or share with you some background on the traditional role of monasteries and religious institutions in the protection of the environment.
Teni thomer teni gomba teni nyenkhor teni khorikta teni chokchak teni chongchoshi pa te tang teni te mayem ba ngacho teni ta shirdang teni ta chongchop shi gosa teni gomba mayem bi teni chongchoshi sa sacha tini la ti khabar chimbo yores.
Generally speaking, there's a large difference between the traditional areas of environmental protection in the surrounds of monasteries and other designated environmental protection zones.
Tani jayu tani khapsyang tani Pejin lota chemo tani ramjum basi tani korang tani ramjum ba tani shatsum tani jimjikshi pi shatsum res ti khapsyang res.
And the difference between these two zones of environmental protection is something that a PhD student from Beijing University wrote their thesis on.
Tani korang choda tani ngaso tani boba ga sacha ga tani khori chongchushen ga makashi ga nyamjir shini tani lo mambo la tani boba ga sacha la tani tashi shibares.
And this research was done over a span of several years by working with people working on environmental protection in Tibetan areas.
Teni takshishi bine kamna teni gomba ga teni chongchoshi yo sa te tang teni gomba mayim ba ga teni chongchoshi yo sa tini ki parla shetang nika yang chongchoshi pi sacha yemban rawa reta yena ti thola teni nibat la hale ba khaparchimbo yo paten di zum dinala shayoret.
And so the focus of this dissertation really was the different in impact or the difference in results between environmental protection areas around monasteries and those of other or designated environmental protection areas.
Tani gomba tini nyenkhorla gomba kangdang kangena gomba nyenkhorla tini lewer kungli chinja chwanganda tini zik nangla tini chokchagyenare tini zishangyenare zhiwuze otoso changma tini ta phnsum sokpa tini yores.
The areas within a 10 to 15 kilometer radius of monasteries had really wonderful conditions or in terms of animal life and plant life.
Yena gomba te so yang yarjang matsri gongdo tini chtorlak thebanda tini yores.
Before the monasteries were restored, of course there were environmental harms and destructions done in the areas in their surrounds.
Teni gomba yo tsari jis teni gomba nyen korte sola teni chokchak yang mambo teni chemang lanro yore teni tsishang yang teni mambo ta naka chemang lanro ni teni chongkyub yakbo thapkan dos.
After the monasteries were restored, so post-cultural revolution, then the animal life and plant life in their surrounds increased in number.
Teni gomba tso go teni gomba ga teni gendan bandra ota tso yena teni kosum mambo zik teni khori ko thola teni tarta chama ga teni tortang shek yores.
So many members of the sangha of monasteries pay a lot of attention to the natural environment.
Teni tan de teni to nga cho teni yang Sichuan ga teni mzorge ga shola res. Sichuan ga poba ga sacha res.
This is an area in the Tibetan area in Sichuan province.
Oh yeah. Poba ga sacha res tarta ti Sichuan ga nangla yores.
Within Tibetan area within the contemporary Sichuan province.
Teni the gomba ga tawata teni khori chongchu shenken zu ko so nyam de lekale yores.
And the monks at this monastery are collaborating with environmental workers from outside.
Teni koso shima teni ta ni thola shima nangla teni sa ta teni shene yin rangbo zala teni shen de ta thang de ngaman di nangla teni nge gongla shapa tere shima nyonyo ma to yo ma ta teni lo jipcheng ap chis ka nangla ja chimbo teni re song dos.
This, as Khenpo said before, was an area in which at the beginning there was hardly any desertification, but which over the period of 40 to 50 years became essentially all sand. So they're really doing work in planting grass.
Teni gomba dang teni khori chongkyup ko leka lenkan khonso nyam de teni leka leni teni jimandala teni chumje yakpo sa ti thola san moni chumje yakpo thondus.
And through the collaborative efforts of the monks and the environmental workers in planting grass in these areas, they obtained very good results. And these are the results of their efforts.
Khori strongkyup ko nangni teni boba ga teni gomba chota teni strojing gringni teni strokchak chongkyu shepatela teni halepa ko so thongshin shekres.
So within the traditional idea of, or the religious idea of protecting the environment, the protection of animals in particular is regarded as extremely important.
Shirtanga chonjambolang ga nala teni strokchak chongkyu shenka mambondos.
In the world, in general, there are a lot of people who work for the protection of animals.
However,
the purposes or objectives of people doing this work vary markedly. The real basic or fundamental reason that monasteries and monks engage in protecting animals is due to their approach to compassion.
Teni ti thola teni chechok tamje pon ramnim goni teni negowa chechok ramnim tela teni ko so halepa karchim bon jokore jemsen tini la teni chokchok la teni chongkyup shek yores.
It's on account of the importance that they attribute to the equality of all living beings that they engage in work for the protection of animals.
Teni koransa go muir kandaz ga thola jabato samgo resina teni sagolandi thola teni mun namya yakbo ne thamkan Teni chokchak nawa yakpone tamkan sama nyamde yakpone tamkan tenis yong je muyer tenis ka thone khoso le kale ndos.
And the goal of their work is for humans and all other living beings, animals, etc., to be able to coexist in harmony on the earth.
Teni ta pena chokchak chongchup ko ngad sina teni ta tandela teni wopa go xiayang ze gre zangma ji ze ya zangma ji ze ge tere sin di sha de.
There is the Tibetan eared pheasant is the bird in these pictures.
Teni den zambolong ko thola teni popa ga sacha ma to yo janna yo mare ze chokchak teni la jimjik shin kanam go teni ze ndos.
And bird researchers say that this bird is, in fact, this pheasant is unique to the Tibetan plateau.
Teni ngamanda poinna teni tanda teni korang yosa de tezi jachimbo da teni borjung ko sachata teni tarong ti parchun la yang tezi mambu da won degsi tezi jachimbo da bores korang yosa.
And the area in which this pheasant previously lived was bigger in scope than it presently is. It's in a TAR and a bit over the border there.
Teni inna teni tartan teni koso teni shan teni sacha chimbuzula yo maresi tarta.
However, these days this bird is found in only a very small number of places.
Teni tarta inna teni borjung go teni loka shanlan ze gel loka go teni gumba tsogun takala nyonshu ma to ba jamba tsangma me pari tsar sons.
And in fact, these days, this bird is only found in the surrounds of several monasteries in the Loka area of central Tibet.
Teni sacha jambala teni me pari sona yang tarong yang gumba gan takala tarong shande yores.
And in other areas where the bird has completely disappeared, there are cases where it can still be found in the vicinity of monasteries.
Teni shande teni jarkup ko teni rumba nipa ga teni chongchup shi go sares archipa hudungu.
And this pheasant is designated a level 2 protection animal to be protected, perhaps endangered species in China.
Teni gumba ga teni ta shande la chongchup shi go wi jimchen teni ta yang shamnyang ji ta chechong da nyim da de go ni rema to ba jambala gumba la pam ba kepan ka yo mares.
And the reason for the monasteries in protecting this pheasant the reasons are the compassion to start with, and secondly, the view of equality of all living beings. Aside from these, there's no other, overt value for the monasteries in protecting this bird.
Teni gomba ga teni koso teni shand so shirtang rila ne pa ga teni sharez yeshang rila ne pa ga share ina gomba koso teni shand so namjin teni koso chongchup she ga yores.
This bird is actually a wild species that usually, lives in the mountains. However, the monasteries in these cases undertake work for their protection.
Teni shanda yosata nga zo teni boba ga teni borjung ga sacha ga teni sami chimpoda teni gar thokar zena ti nyenkor tere te so teni gumba yosati nyenkor la teni shanda dos.
So these birds can be found in the areas surrounding Samye Monastery and other small monasteries in this area.
Teni yang teni sha ni pa zerizi teni nden rawo ina teni yang shanda la teni to zhichun zi teni shanda yang teni to ta sha hal chang ga teni kombo zeris.
There's a second kind of bird which is extremely rare, the buff-throated partridge.
Teni ngama ina yang de teni to ta tezi tabja chibores teni sacha mambola dos.
In days gone by, this bird could be found in a wide range of areas.
Teni tandi shanda ina teni to tan zambolong teni din zambolong rang shong kyub namrir zi teni soba zren de soba inji ga ma ti tholan de o ti nangla teni jayong kan teni sha teni ga karchin res.
This bird is regarded as extremely important by, I think it would be perhaps the International Wild, what do we call it? The International Wildlife Fund.
Teni tarta ina teni te shanda teni yang gumba chicken takala ma to jamba sama me pare charres.
But this bird actually now is only found in the surrounds of one single monastery. It's disappeared everywhere else.
Teni gombandu teni yang Sichuan ge sachala yopa ge boba ge teni sacha ge gombares.
And this monastery is found in the Tibetan area of Sichuan province.
Te boba ge teni khamba ge loshok la yoris.
In the southern area of Kham.
Teni gombandu so teni ti lama ta gomba ge chirka ta teni te gomba ge teni chabare changma ge teni shandela teni hajang tongxin shi ni teni zhongqiu shi ge yoris.
And the lamas and monks in this monastery really place a great value on this bird and do a lot for its protection.
Teni korang so teni shandela teni zhongqiu shi go ya ge jimsen kan rezina teni yang sham nyar je go ni zhongqiu shi ore ma to ba jamba yo mares.
But again, their reasons for doing this are the compassion towards animals. There's no other motivation behind their efforts.
Teni ta shanda chikpu mare teni to gomba kang yin na teni koso nyin khor la yong kan ga teni chokchag yin na rtag yin na nya yin na sha yin na chamala teni gomba ga teni chongchu yabu che yore.
But it's not just this bird that they're interested in protecting. All living beings, animals or birds or fish, wild animals, etc., found in the surrounds of this monastery are all equally protected.
Teni yin song di teni sha yin na rtag yin na teni teso yin na teni kale me koso me doi kapsa kale chishong chenyong re ne tin thama teni gomba ga teni nyendam la teni ren ndus.
So these different species, while they've declined in the wider environment over a period of years, now can only be found in the surrounds of the monastery.
Teni gomba te ina teni ta nga cho chokchak mambo zu ke teni ta nyol shasa na pilan so. Oh, teni re yores.
Oh, okay. So now the monasteries serve as refuges for these animals.
Ya nyenkale teni yorne teni desa teni rawore teni gomba so nala tarong yang chokchak teni hachang ko kombo te so tin thakala mambo yores.
So now in the surrounds of monasteries there are many animals that are very rare.
Teni khoso teni chokchak la teni chongchu shi go wa teni samlo to teni chu na ne yong yores.
And their motivations or the reasons for protecting these animals are derived from the Tibetan religious tradition.
Teni shanda sogut ngoma shanda teni gomba la khoso la teni khepanji yo mare je khorso khwanjol la khepen yo mare chiji la khepen yo marta yena ti khoso jampang go ni teni chongchu shi ge yores.
These birds in themselves don't have any intrinsic value to the monasteries themselves. They don't have great economic value or anything like this. Their motivation of the monasteries in protecting these birds is out of altruistic concern for other beings.
Teni nga chon de yang nga choteni teni boba ga sacha nir teni zres. Anyambo yisi zegres.
This is Nyambo Yitsi, a sacred mountain in the vicinity of a Tibetan monastery.
Teni tan din yin khor la yo kan ka teni sha ta rtag ta teni khorik ta so chama te teni gomba chik te chongchu yakbo che yores.
And the wildlife in this area, on this mountain, birds and wild animals, etc., are protected by a monastery nearby.
Okay,
the name of this animal is Sham.
Yeah. Tani ngama yenda tani boba tani the sosan ni tani ta ku tani takala jarkeres.
In Tibetan history, the pelt of this animal was used as decoration on Tibetan robes.
Tani ti kapsa tani ta boba ga mambo san ni tani ta chung jaw tani mambo shi tani shi pi jimsen ji tani kapchigla tani nyimbo yesin dinala pena lu nishi tamba tani zgrangla tani sham da tawani mepa chak songres.
And because of Tibetans who were engaging in the capturing and killing and trade of these animals, within the span of 20 years, the number of Sham on this mountain became very, very few indeed.
Tani nitong jigolola tani bobaga tani the korik chongchop ko tani the don de samlo tangne tani gu tani gongwata parongda tesola shamda zigda tagda teso gerwa te meba jagares.
However, in 2004, out of concern for the protection of the environment, the Tibetan tradition of adorning their robes with the pelts of different rare animals was abandoned.
Teni ti kapsi teni ta gumba yang teni de la tabu jamne teni ta chongchu shi japares.
And at this time and from this time, the monastery in the vicinity looked after these animals.
Teni nitong denni zongti teni ta sham halle ba mamboz teni ta ti nyekor so na te la yores.
And from 2007, the number of sham in this area have increased dramatically.
Teni nitong jeta nitong deng par la lorsem ma to son yo mares.
Between 2004 and 2007 was only a period of 3 years.
Teni lorsem kana la teni mambo chokchak mambo ta sar ka chini yar mambo rendo je teni yo mares lorsem kana la teni compare tendo yo mares.
Generally speaking, it's not really possible for such great changes to take place in a period of 3 years.
Yena teni chokchang de so na teni kosola munam go kosola no pa shita mashite koran so sem gana la go ndus.
Si.
Chokchang de so muso kosola no pa shita mashit koso ha go ndus.
However, these animals know in their own minds whether or not people are going to harm them or not.
Teni munam ji kosola no pa mashiwa teni ni song jiglo la ni zonte no pa mashiwa shi japi jilni teni mambo teni ta Gasa gawala tini ta tongji yo pa tini resons.
But knowing from 2004 onwards that people were not going to harm them, the numbers of these sham really increased and they began to emerge all over the place.
Teni tarta tini chini popa ga tini ku thakala maggerwa ta nipa tini gomba ga tini chongcho shi pa chamala tini tarta shamde gasa gawala tini ta mambu tongji yo res.
So in addition to the abandoning of the practice of of wearing animal skins, animal pelts, and the efforts of monasteries in protecting these animals, their numbers have increased and they can be seen all over the Tibetan landscape.
Tani di nya tso tini ta nyambo yerse ga nala yo pa ga tini nya yang khoso tini chongchu shi de gomba ga chongchu shi de tiso res.
And the fish in this photo is a species that is protected also in this area by the monastery.
Teni khoso mula ti ngama ina khoso mula chawane chakshi marezi tina ga mo no pa ma shi gomba chongchu shi bi jimsenji chakshi marezi.
In history, these fish had absolutely no fear of humans.
Teni ta da gomba chongchu shi teni shi bi teni jimsenji teni khoso go teni pena ngi gomba ndo teni koyong ken ga mo ina teni khoso chawane chakamarezi.
The fish, if it's a person wearing red robes who approaches them, then they do not have any fear. However, those who approach them wearing trousers, they feel a lot of fear towards.
Mambo haleba mambo teni yar lenni teni ta par zongjeta teni mambo she ores gomba mepi kapsa.
And the reason is that before the monastery was there, or before it was restored, there were a lot of people who came and caught the fish and in order to sell them.
Teni ta ngama tarta ta teni ngama gomba mepi kapsa teni nya mambo lenni te zongba teni ka parla teni parchi lo simchindawo teni song ores.
There was a period of about 30 years when there was no monastery and these fish were being caught in large numbers to be sold.
Teni khoso tarta yang teni dorma kyongkhen tang teni la teni chakayo bi jimsen te teni nyan de so teni che rangbo teni yena yana korang cho teni ji korang cho ji teni sim go tone yena ji jamba z go ne korang cho nya ga teni rab ni pa nya ga yena korang go murb ni pa ta te la teni shan zhou yo na chuan di xin xi ze o teni zhou na te karin ha go me gangster korang cho teni ta lo simchi go gongla teni dorma kyong khen go mambo zayo re te na tasta yang ko so chakandis.
So exactly how these fish have communicated this fear or distrust of trouser-wearing people is not exactly sure. However, over the period of 30 years that these fish were caught by people coming to their habitat, their fear towards people wearing plain clothes still exists among second generations and later generations of these fish. How to explain this is something, that is rather difficult.
Losum ganala tini shamcho tini mutso no pamashiwa ta hakovine kona koso lower tini mambo yongwa ota tini nyanda so tini lo sumchu kongrola koso la no pakyawa te tarung yang tini semla tini yoate ti ngasu gandhi gune hak reshit gandhi jabgo hako me kantar chokchang de so tini semkham ganala ngasu hamako mambo ndugusi.
How exactly it is that these fish still experience fear towards humans in plain clothes, or how it is that animals repopulate when they sense that they're no longer going to be harmed is something that is difficult to explain, but there's a lot of things about animals that we really can't explain.
Dini achak kan jula mrong da kyang da khkhsili wuren chüze jag zena dini nga so me cha ga dini sartung dini je de la dini kyang da mrong da dini mambo yores.
In the Khenchen area of the Tibetan Plateau, in an area which is empty of human habitation, there are many deer and other such wildlife.
Dini ti kyang dam jong te so ngi komban ro ndri kong khani na tini stak mare nga su komban ndri ko na thang ni pu lan ro nan ro thap krezi.
So these deer and wild yaks, etc., if it is someone wearing monastic robes who approaches them, then they don't feel any fear at all.
Dini mo jamba na tini jangrangbo ma parjam khanda te so na jangrangbo ma to khut jamlan ro thap marezi.
Whereas other people not wearing robes, say those taking pictures, etc., can only approach them at a distance.
Tani Zhongguo tani the Wi Nyam Chen Kang zena Zhongyang Dianshi Tai ge tani Chenlum ge ba Zhou Pin Tai Zhou Pin Dao ze khosu tani khkhsili la par jab sa song res.
Some photographers from CCTV Channel 9 in China traveled to Khenchen to take photos of these animals.
Tani khona so tani Gimsen te ha ko ti tani khoso jamba chola zene khoso and what
they were told on going there was if they wanted to take photos of the animals, then they would have to wear monastic robes.
What
they said was, well, maybe we don't dare to wear exactly your monastic robes, but we'll wear clothes that are similar to them.
Tani khkhsili tani kyangdam jong te so tani mesala yore ti nyenkola gomba yo marese.
In this area in Khenchen, it's a place where there are no human inhabitants, no monasteries.
Yena tani nga so lo tongchang mambo rang la tani ta gomba ngdi ta lo tongchak chik da lhag ze gore. Lo tongchak chik da lhag ze rang la gomba ngdi khosola tani tongchu shi ba ta Nevertheless,
the fact that monasteries have and religious personnel have been protecting the environment for a period of over thousands of years is something that the wildlife here know and understand. How they do that, is a question. Tani gomba loso ta tani khori chongchok ko parla ndra halle pa tamzbi ores. So there is a very deep and profound connection between Tibetan monasteries and Tibetan traditional culture and the protection of the natural environment. Tani ndya nga so gomba chi katini ta nyinkhor katini rzre tani chongong yangchin la ores gomba chi nyinjam la yo pi rzres. And this mountain is found in the surrounds of a monastery in Qinghai province. And wildlife, it is absolutely forbidden that wildlife be killed in this mountainous area. And this prohibition was also in place before the 1950s.
샹크 소이나 되니 더 고소 되니 로바 소 되니 샹크 사거리 되나 되니 샹크 소도 남긴 되니 고소 딩골란도니 드그레스.
So wolves are something that are frequently killed by nomadic populations in Tibet. So a lot of wolves come to this mountain to live.
되니 nga마 되니 보바 카시가 되니 스트럭처 되니 응운바가 되니 응운 잡이네 그나 되니 러당다 되니 nda가 잡니 메장나 되니 코랑촌 루토나 다 인다만단 디톨라 사찬데라 준로 그레스.
So in the past, when Tibetan hunters were pursuing wild animals, the wild animals would flee to this mountain for refuge.
되니 샹크당 르닥다 데수 창마 고소 니 사찬데라 소나 고살로 노바시가 마레 삼바데 고소 창마데니 셈거나라 하고요레스.
And wolves and wild animals knew that if they came to this mountain, they would be safe from danger.
되니 딘디인디 되니 가서 되니 곰바가 되니 로소도 되니 다 추나네 되니 샴당 냐르지데 소레스.
So the practices and traditions of the monastery are founded in compassion and loving kindness.
되니 샴당 냐르지데 가서 사마가 셈거나라 약보즈 요나 되니 가서 뭐다 거리니까 약보 도냠바 빙항세 도냠바고네 약보 네탑근데스.
If we have generated compassion and loving kindness properly in our minds, then it is possible for us to view animals and humans with complete equality.
되니 뭐당 쪽장니 맞은 뭐당 코리니까요. 되니 뭐가 셈나라 샴다 냐르제다 잠펑그 삼로테요나 뭐당 코리니까요. 잠념 약보더니 네탑근데스.
So not just an equality between humans and animals, but also with the quality of compassion, we can also approach humans and the environment with a mind of equality.
된디 엔디 가존 잠볼랑 것들이 더 로다 침보남 그 나라양 시르다 락서다 짱바즈 장니 시르 로종시야 당 락서 로종시야 짱바즈 그 자원인 그 만두스.
So in terms of the universities in the world today, if what people are studying is only knowledge and skills alone, then this is quite insufficient.
디 인담만당 샴당 냐르제당 데니 더 네 잠판당 뜻소 토라 상로 망보 땅 종더 망보 시 딘디 시고군두스.
It's very important that students also be studying and training in compassion, loving kindness.
나서 전탕 갔다와 데라 기르주 잡고군두스.
We need to really reform our values.
나서 대랑 전탕 갔다와 망치와 뜻니 줄리 사르지 군즈 비네급 그 문남 그 포아 똑 비네급 그 삼로레스.
Really, the value system that we have today is a carryover from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution when everybody had hungry stomachs.
되니 디름니시 짜니 짜직 바가나랑아 좀문남 그 포아 격차리 지스 다양 삼로 땅서 카카시고 사레스.
Now, in the 21st century, where everybody is no longer hungry, it's necessary that we search for a new approach, new ideas.
다른 양마가 삼로 냥바티 토난 득나티니 가서 마음 반응 가서 수수티니 득삼에 바틴디 차크레스.
If we proceed along the values with these outdated values, then in the future we will be without anywhere to live ourselves.
나서 까르마 무무르 토란 로고연 문남 텔라 포기엔세니 차르지저 티니 mam보레고요레스.
A lot of people talk about moving to human habitation to other planets.
레당 운이 장랭아서 카요라요 가서 고향 오마다 나랑서 사고라 종주시야 데리스.
But really what we need to do is devote our efforts to protecting this earth that we live on.
이나 가서 노바 찬전시 마트나 가서 탑시면도 종야 종탑그 말이 탑시면도.
However, without reining in our desires and keeping them in check, we've got really no possibility of being able to protect the environment.
덴디엔디 가서 문남 것들이 노바더니 선즘시시 그 르니데 강란데 탑시데 강란데 디 인담마다 삼로 당고인데스.
So really we need to devote a lot of thought to the culture of protecting the environment and the means through which we're going to do it.
데니 너양 코랑서 곰바즈 그때니 데니 샤즈 데니 종주시바가 로지레스.
And this is a picture which shows monasteries work in protecting a bird.
공소고더니 랑코르 람카솔라 remote니 광가운다 온 렘다 잡니더니 종주시 고세요레스.
So by painting this picture on the roadside, they're sort of making an advertisement or engaging in an education campaign for the sake of environmental protection.
Tini the Koranso Zungshikanala Gomba Nish Tsani Luzi, Gomba Nish Tsani Lama Tamchipo Mountain, Yaga Lieming Jambo, Nyam the Tinita Mountain, Shanda Chonchu Gozi, Tendushi Baris.
And this is a picture from one particular county in Tibet where 22 monasteries have got together and lamas have signed a petition in order to support a particular species of bird. So in this way, these 22 monasteries are together placing great importance on the protection of this bird.
And the
monk in this picture is an individual who has researched birds and worked on the protection of birds for a period of 17 years. He's traveled to all corners of the Tibetan region, researching birds and working on their protection.
And
these pictures are his drawings of the different birds that he has researched and seen on his travels over all of these years.
And so his
work that he's been engaging in is on the research of birds, documenting them through these pictures, and also working with monasteries for their protection. And these are not photos, these are pictures drawn by his hand, and they're pictures of birds that he has seen or watched with his own eyes.
And
here there are a few illustrations related to the protection of the environment.
Ngaso korik te latini tongchu shia te ngaso shandong chet tinti shejna teni thola teni shala no pare teni ta chokchak chongchong la no pare no pa mambu yong yo re se teni kasa kawala te leka teni ko teni thamala hako rishin de tujak sheg yo re.
So this was a picture, a drawing also drawn by him, educating people about the harms that may occur if trees are cut down to the various life forms that dwell in them.
Teni teranga ngaso ngaso ti bogen naten go teni chokchak khorik chongchu shia teni dordi chamse teni namba tamje pola teni jipa ngocho shipa yin teni sama teni yaponien so tiji che.
So thanks everybody to listening today to my brief introduction about the traditional Tibetan Buddhist approach to environmental protection.
Teni ola teni tarong chisu shekaz yorezi ti nangla teni ngaso pansan teni jwa teleng goni teni sosola tokbayo na ngaso teni shine teni samlu jiri teni su shena te yakbo yores.
We have about half an hour where we can have some questions and can engage in an exchange of ideas over some of these issues.
So if you have to leave, go ahead, but otherwise, anybody has questions or comments?
Thank you very much for your talk, Kempo. So I have a question. Maybe I'll just say it in English. Yeah, and maybe I can say it in Tibetan after. So my question is, Kempo mentioned a number of times about people wearing red and then animals not being afraid of the people wearing red, right? And my question is, does he think Well, I guess how does he think that happened? You know, does he think that the animals grow accustomed to seeing people in red and then realize that they're sort of acting kind to them? Or does he think it's the sort of behavior of the individuals that somehow can attract the animals? Should I say it in Tibetan now? Okay. Kembla, do you say any kirang suyala the Nangishvayore?
Last of
the Ganjishuyati you, the Karsa, Kirangi Sumidele, the Mabu Yungen, Mamu Sumbara, Mabu Yungen, Mabu Yuna, and the Semjen, the Shigma race, right? And they told ya, and the Kirangi Sumna, the Karina, the Jimson Karade, and the Konzo Kali Gongirwe, Yamena, the Mabu Yungen, so the Suzuki Yunden, Jimson Suzuki Yunden, and Jimson Karade.
Yeah. Then Koranso teni chokchakla teni jimjikshin ke mamboz ke Koranso te tokbaki ngde Koranso zena katok marbote teni chokchakso umtongla koso teni tela chakreze teni marbote kyonna teni koso teni gaki mare teni zeni tambo teni zegndouze.
So some researchers say that in fact the color red is in fact a color that animals feel great fear towards, and that seeing this color is something that they would feel fear towards.
Yena teni jima teni Koranso teni te poba sachana yo pa teni chokchakte so teni musrindig teni marbola chak mendugze Koranso te shindugze.
But then they discovered or found out that in Tibetan areas, animals do not in fact feel fear towards the color red and people wearing this color.
Ti Gimson Savati kan rezena teni ta poga sachala teni pena lo tongchakshik teni zika rangla teni koze marbu kyongkang teni chaba chogo teni gomba nyenkor la yongkang teni chokchak te sola chigni nopa mashi ni ne chongchyo she teni she pi Gimson ji te korang to tunro yin na Koranso tenis gogundusi. The Gimson titi koso nopa mashiwata chongkyoshi bi Gimson jirendusi.
And the reason is because the animals in these areas understand that people wearing these robes, so the monks and lamas, etc., are not only not harming them, but are also working for their protection. This is something they understand.
Teni tere mato te Koranso la teni chi yondun yota meta teni ta kosa marez. So ta koso nopa mashipada koso la yakboshi bi Gimson ti rendusi.
So it's not really a question of the animals understanding the virtue or the merits of the monks or lamas in question. It's really their understanding that these people are not going to hurt them and are going to protect them.
So Khenpo talked a bit earlier about the way in which in many cultures you have this discourse of dominating the environment or conquering the environment. And he said that in Tibetan religious discourse or Tibetan common social perceptions, you don't really have that kind of language, but rather you have one of more cooperation with the environment or respect for the environment. And so I wanted to ask about two ways in which people have said, pointed out that even in traditional Tibetan society, you have that language is actually present. So one would be in the very famous myth in the imperial period where the earth is represented as a demoness, a simo. And essentially the Tibetan Buddhism comes and it pins her down with temples. It's not a very nice imagery, it's very violent. And that demoness, who is clearly connected to the natural earth because these local spirits are resisting Buddhism, and all those local spirits are very associated with forest and lakes and mountains and so forth. And they're also very aggressively dealt with. I mean, they're violently subjugated, and they're made into slaves of the Dharma, otherwise known as servants of the Dharma. So that's one whole gestalt of things. That story about the demoness who's tamed with the initial Buddhist temples, and then the ongoing battle with the autochthonous forces of the Tibetan earth through using exorcistic domination rituals that have so much language of violence, domination, subduing, etc. And then the other thing would be some Tibetans, contemporary Tibetan lamas, and some Western scholars have also looked at traditional Buddhist representations of sacred places, of sacred mountains and so forth, and pilgrimage practices. And one's a very famous Tibetan lama, Tenzin Namdak, who's a Bumpo lama, and argued that the Buddhist accounts of these sacred places isn't really interested in the natural environment. it's very abstract. And they look at the literary analysis of these and how a description of one place could be a description of any place. And they've argued that it's very abstracted from the realities of that place. And so very at odds with people who, in a contemporary conservation movement, are interested in the particularities of a place for its own value, not for its value in some Buddhist scheme or something, or Christian scheme. So those are two kind of counterpoints, and I wonder what he would say about those.
The current tatila shirtan current so taling dram mambo jabbling dram mambo yona churches tambo.
It's possible to have many kinds of explanation of this.
Reta current so zenat in this mares in poke chuluk zenayont in this mares.
But the Tibetan religious tradition does not speak of the need to subdue.
Yeah. Tani current so zena perna tini ngatso poke tini lodji thola tani poke sachazi kita tini stmo kankir tini yamda o tini zini tani shayo ti thola tini ta sakang mambo jani tani ti thola tini stmo par darwanda o tini shayo res.
According to the traditional account, the Tibetan land is a supine demoness who is pinned down by planting temples on different parts of her body.
Yena darwati la tini ta koso tini ta ju korik yena da tini te sacha yena da pensum jesokta jezang ma tok ba tini remon darya ga ton da la salo cheta dorko cheta chi yabgir mabgir shechinda tini ringo tini koyanda shangchayanda tini sheyo mareze.
So even while they did engage in these acts of, submitting the demoness in terms of actual, really more significant physical ways of altering the environment, cutting down forests and redirecting waterways, these were not things that they did. So I suppose the argument is that this was more of a symbolic.
Teni koso samna teni remo zenanda, dat zenanda, kandizila zena. Tani pena lotok yang pomoyong wanda o tani chelok yung wanda sayum yung wanda derangshong kam ko nopa mambo yung kan tindi nipa tindi zela ngunzen che yore tin derjana ti mepa tini yakporen to ta koso tindi zela ngunzen ge yore.
But what people did think was that many natural disasters or negative phenomena in the climate, etc., were related to things like demonesses and other forces in the natural landscape, and on this account it was necessary to subdue them.
Tindizela ngunzeng yore tini te mepa shejana tani korigi nanda mo lipo nanda mo semkom nanda jedi chekila tini rogorezine koso tini ngunzeng shegde.
What they did say that was by bringing these forces under control, then people's lives in all aspects, their material flourishing, their state of mind, etc., would only continue to get better and better.
Yeah, tujiche.
And that tarun deni driven nibayo.
Yeah.
Deni that driven nibayina di yang mukashe zena di nangche deni work sacha la ta chabi jesu deni rangjong ko yuda matsa di bombo kdawa shukchebo yore take chebo da deni dasu chebo re deni nang work nangjin deni work sacha deni ta chabi jesu nangbe chulila 동호스 데니 랑종 코유기 캐치했던 사차 데니 내리는자 초이는자 나기는자 고소 랑종 코유기 캐치라 도는 제보 시기 요 말에 고소 그다와 데니 출 그다와 데니 고소 칠 그데니 차니 랑종 코리 데니 다우기 요래 다 고소 문이 다다이나 다 고소 랑종 코이라 순주 데니 시eken 코유 고소 랑소소 그 링탕 다 고유그 냉nak ring탕 소크 ring탕 랑중 고유그 ring탕 모든 시기 요래는 용 데이비드 지기다 디 남비 추고도 그다와
다음에 거송 데 카실라텐디 코소 삼트리오나요 초코레 거랑 소랑 그 삼트리나 네 삼로다나 텐리 마레사 네 다리콘라 코리우 톤쪽라 거랑라 따와 숨시한도 봐 숨시하고 바가나니 지그득 거레지나 페나 거랑 네르리 teni rangore chore ji tendiga ko lam chore je anda nere re je anda tendi yore testik teni ni tu pinna teni khori khorang ga rangshong kham khorang ga nge tari kong de mum thong wa ga dera ji yore ji sha so thong wa mai be nga so ni ku mam thong wa na wa ga mar pa lak pa ga rak ki me na yang teni khorang la teni gimri je na la yon ji wa di gimri de kang re je na teni khori khorang ga gimri tere khori khorang la to lak shi jna teni nga so la teni ta ta mando pa yong ya teni ga teni ta khori khorang gam dera tere nge kona sha pa ta wa sim yo pa na ni ta wa chi te tere teni nga so tela nga so tin nang ba ga chu na la shi ga gimri ta nang ga gimri je gre nang ga gimri je ki ta teni ma ga sem ko korwa tela je gre tela ha jang to nang she gre shi ga gimri je ki ta khori ka gimri tela to nang she gre nge sam lo ta na ni ka ti yo re sam ga
So it's possible that some people may have that idea that the Buddhist tradition did not value natural areas for their intrinsic value, but Khenpo does not personally think this is the case. And in his lecture this afternoon, he spoke of the three views underpinning the traditional need for the protecting the environment, and spoke of the law of cause and effect, or the relationship of action and consequence, as manifesting in both ways that are perceptible, tangible, able to be seen with our eye, and as well as this kind of relationship of cause and effect that works in a more imperceptible, intangible, in some ways unknowable way. And Khenpo's argument is that valuing the natural environment on its own intrinsic characteristics is linked with this second kind of belief in the intangible relationship of cause and effect between human actions and the environment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nga to da ti online de computer de non ti on de na so mo mo no ina ta software de ni kuma de ni no no da ta mai na ti ge se de ye fi le ti ge ta ran ta la pa no ti ge ngi ta ta da na ti sa ta do ta ni na ti ge din je da ma ta kon na ta sung ka no me sha ba ge la ni ni ye de ta ge ma thank you ta ma ka na ti ge ti ge ta ti ge ya bu ye ti ge ta na so nga na de nya bu ye ti so ka ne ti ge yang boleh sih itu kalau yang tadi mau khusus itu cuma ni software tadi senang dah ni orang software dah ada kurikulum ni dah nampak macam kita gitu ni. Dia tadi yang mau mana gumba soto dah tadi kita semua orang tadi cari naya dah tadi kamu yang dia nanti kalau sampai untuk mana luas.
저런 거 인지 잡시나 인지 저기 놀디 셔. 알았어. 야. teni ta khon kan de da nga so teni chog na la tirin jog ji yore de oya teni to mambo phenna teni chog na la teni yang khori bakhla de ro kong ura bakhla de ro ta ti kan di go re kong to song do tengu mare nana nyambo yirse ga teni nang la nyambo yirse ga na la teni khori chong chup ko chong don so song ti ka sa nga yang song ti ka sa teni nga chu ka ja da mambo she pa yin teni nga chu pe na chog na la teni chokterin jogze wonterin jogze ne teni mrug mambo teni mambo lug jagna teni mambo re son ti teni mrug to so teni na ne chig na ne ri ne teni chama dik bo yo chen ra ta teni ti to chi teni nya da to so la teni no pa yong chen ra ta teni mambo dik chi re teni ni re teni tari kyorang ge so nge te ri so te pe na yang ti chonang lan jo chi pong tir to so yang 총강나라 종지고 살이더니 총강나라 종지고나 띠나라 되니 봉티르사와니 말이 띠나라 되니 도스르다다 되니 사다더니 망볼루장데 도스르다다 셰당 사이나다 쳬고나라 띠 짝지리다 도스르다 되니 망볼루데 대소 콜라티니 다 코리 그 나라양 shukchine yang te korigla te no pa yongand ta te tinti mambo lugnan recommend garten software jona nyong ma ton jon nyang manduk zene te mambo shasong te chorang ga ngomare te ti thola nga so gomba so le kale go sares.
So the question was about the throwing of what are they called in English? The auspicious bundles or vases filled with all kinds of sacred substances, grain and jewels and all of this kind of thing. The depositing of them in the lake in Sakamunjere. Nyembo Itse. And Khenpo agreed with the idea that this is very or potentially quite harmful to the natural environment. Apparently a meeting on environmental protection was convened last year. Khenpo attended it. And a lot of people talked about how the fact that, a lot of grain and other things being tipped in or being deposited into the lake causes a situation where the grains rot and a nasty smell is generated, and in general it's not good for the lake environment. And Khenpo was saying that also the kind of auspicious vases that are often sold in shops often have various kinds of toxic substances inside them, and this is not good either. So in future people should be more circumspect with their practices of putting these auspicious vases in the sacred lake.
Tarngu judar mana tarngu konda jinfa ya tarngu to teni ngamaina ring ngola yore ta ri mare to sama njigri sulya njigri teni tingola teni tarngu mambo rongola ta jana teni to sajivla sona yang ti chishok njigri te korigla no payonga ta teni mambo to nga so tano boba so mambo shiyo mare ti thola leka yang bole gondu.
Another problem is prayer flags, which were traditionally made of fabric, but now they're often made of plastic. And when they're taken down, they're quite often just thrown into the water. This is a serious problem, but it's something that a lot of Tibetans don't really know about.
Yeah, thank you.
其实我的问题是说，我们看到说，就是寺院的生活，它本身是有助于环境保护的，因为慈悲观。然后可是那寺院和一般村民的互动，会不会也使得说一般村民能够受到这个寺院的影响，而更加意识到，比如说业就是他们的作为是会对环境产生影响的。那另外就是说，特别是现在年轻一代的藏人，他们对于环境的这个态度是什么？我们知道说藏人是非常 religious oriented， 就是非常宗教型的一个民族，可是我不晓得年轻一代的藏人是怎么样。
tani nga cho shirtang ga jaba cho gomba ga nang ga tani samlo to mangso ko nang la tani ta ga chu loso jam ni tani tendu she ke yore tani khosola tani shikching kala kansam tani yore ze nga cho pena gomba chi ka tani jamla tani jogba na rongba na to so yang ti gomba ga samlo to khosola shikchin shirtang ti yore.
In general, the ideas or the values of the monasteries and monks do have some influence on the surrounding communities. The monks and lamas, for example, will engage in educating the communities in their vicinities, and these efforts are of some influence.
Yinna tini chokchakla tini nopa ma shewanja tso yang pena gomba ga jabanja wo tini tang zammo tini yang yo maris mercha chola shirtang yore ta tini tang zammo ba chak tini yo maris.
However, the really sort of profound awareness of the importance, say, of protecting animals or something is not necessarily something that is as widely felt in the community.
Tini ngama jai na nga cho tini boba ga nang la shirtang koso go tini churjing go tola khorig la tini nopa she nyang mare samji samlo te yore te chigre tini ni re korang cho go rongwa yin na jogba yin na koso go chowa ga nang la tani korigla tani mbaksok tani kongchi wande marende 환경污染 tindi shiyaga tani ji ganning dada tindi mambo yong mendoze ngamayna yong mendoze.
So in the past, not only was it the case that most Tibetans had the idea that or felt that it was inappropriate to harm the environment or destroy the environment, but at the same time the reality was that farming and nomadic lifestyles really didn't generate a lot of rubbish or pollution.
Tending also Bobaganani, Rumwata, Jobata, Mountso, Mambozik, Shertan, Korea, Nopa Shiznana, Teni, Nopa Yungare, Sambatema, Topa Penangazo, Lodze, Teni, Nopa Gandion, Chishoko, Nopa Gandion, the Su Jimoto, Go Maris.
So, for the majority of nomadic and farming communities, people generally accept the importance of protecting the environment and not harming it. But in terms of specific measures, for example, how to go about disposing batteries, how to go about disposing plastics, etc., these are not things that people know about in any great detail.
Teni Tartanjayana, Teni Tamayang, the Korikotola, Teni Leka Lenkenga, Teni Pobayang, Teni Ndo, Teni Poyuta Porka Tolayang. Kori Katola Sound, the Torture Shiguat in the Yichata, the Sotini Kapar Katola, Parkerkin Jawata, the Java Tota, the so Mambundu, the Mambogata, Yapo Shigioris, Tartaina, Shigioris, Kalikali Shigioris.
In recent years, though, more literature or more information about how to protect the environment, what measures to take, the importance of protecting the environment are being produced for and spread on mobile phone technology, on the internet, etc. So gradually knowledge about environmental protection is on the increase. So in terms of actually doing this work of promoting environmental protection among Tibetan communities, given their existing predisposition or their existing acceptance or openness to this idea, then the work of educating people is relatively easy.
Ngama morang lo nyung in bikapse teni tum chao shongmaura Sichuan la song tum de teni de ko zhongqiu shiwa res.
There is a professor from Beijing University who, when she was quite young in age, came to Sichuan and worked on the protection of the panda.
Teni korang gazena morang gazena teni tika se korang tum teni zhongqiu shi bin kamna te mambu zwa teni ta nga so tum zhongqiu shi go yim sang karere. Tum zhongqiu shi na nga so la kare phan to yo rese mambu teni ko teni lerka tela gyapchur shi manduze.
And at that time, which was quite early on, a lot of people had no support actually for her efforts in protecting the panda and would really ask her, why is it necessary that we do this? What's the value in protecting the panda?
Tani koranga tani zena tani ta morang tani hachang sim pamni ta chokshak chongchub ko lerka de lena tani letra sa mari samni tani nerkap su korang tani de lerka so yigjax.
And feeling extremely disillusioned with the reception of her work, she abandoned her efforts in protecting animals for the time being.
Teni jima yang ko teni popa la yong ne teni te chokshak yang teni ta lerka leche da chokshak chongchub ko lerka leche da ngutzik ba yins.
But then after some time she traveled to Tibet to begin work on environmental protection or animal protection.
Teni ko pola yong ne teni ta nga so teni ta chokshak chongchub she go re radak chongchub she go re ziti teni chama ma chama oh teta go re lergo ta nga so gandhi shi ni teni chongchub she go ze ko so mang chama ma chama mola teni lapsons.
And when she spoke of the need to protect the environment and protect animals, etc., everybody was very supportive. Well, of course, that's something we need to do. They really regarded this as almost an obvious kind of logic.
Teni morang gazena teni koranga ota chokshak chongchub ko lerka ta nga so bonni lena yakbo le thapsare samne teni koranga tarta yang poba ga sachana chokshak chongchub ko lerka ta le de go yores.
And so she felt from that time that working on environmental protection in Tibetan areas was something that could be relatively easily done, and she has continued her work in Tibet from that time to the present day.
Tendi ending azo boga na layang korig la to lak shen kan jawo ta teni chokchak teni to son kan jana da tendi yo re ta yinda shichubni teni le go na yang tabde po yak bonduks.
So whilst, of course, there are people in Tibet who don't respect the environment, who do harm and destroy the environment, in general, doing work for environmental protection in Tibetan areas is relatively more straightforward.
아니 자반 인지에 대한 최대 대비를 주십니다. 이 관계심하죠. 그래서 너무 인지나 주로 중요하다 높은데 정리해 주시오. 그래서 자반 인지에 어떻게 그 소자 너무 인지가 된 정리 성장 그 주로 많이 자반 인지에 하고 So my question is like loving kindness and compassion is religion or not? Because on this planet, religion came like 3,000 years ago, but then loving kindness and compassion exist way before when the life comes on this planet. So that's my question.
Yes. Shertang shambada nyarji na nga so tini chuluk tini samlo tak tak yin bing ba yo marezi chuluk zawa ne ke melin khang ge perna tini la me pernawa wushen lun zhe tini ngu so rang le ba wei wu zhu yi zhe tin ji ge mo so na la yang tini kwarang so la sham nyarji ya bo yong ge mo mang bo yo res.
In general, we don't have to link loving kindness and compassion exclusively with religious traditions. There are, for example, atheists or people who adopt a very materialist views of the world who are able to practice and manifest loving kindness and compassion very well.
Teni nga so nang ba teni chute nga so teni zambalang la shone teni lo tong chang ni ta ngab jar tu jar teni ma to mare teni lo tong chang sim lo tong chang nga teni ne kam nan ro mi ru yori ti kap se on man nam la teni sham nyang ji yong kam me mambu yoris.
And of course, Buddhism is a tradition that's only been around for 2,500 years or so. Before that, for many thousands of years before, prior to that, of course, people had loving kindness and compassion.
Teri ta yena nga so teni bok nang ni teni ta ta chokchak chongchup teni she denken ta teni nga so bok teni chuluk teni samlo shikin tepi gimsen ji res.
However, in the Tibetan context, the Tibetan attitude towards the protection of animals is directly derived from its religious tradition.
Teni nga so teni bok nang la yena ta parcher teni ta sa yena lonyong so yena da musda se na nga so teni chuluk nang ne shapi Shamdang nyarji ta tini shikin matif sagam parchi yo marezi ya kashila tang zapo tebiore kashila tezi tebiore ma to shirtang tsawa ni matif sagam yo sa marezi.
And even up until the present day, among the Tibetan population, there is virtually no one who hasn't been influenced by these values of loving kindness and compassion. There are some people who manifest these values very profoundly or deeply, and others perhaps in a more superficial way, but almost it's impossible to say that there would be anyone who's not been touched by these values.
My question is that based on Tangu's comments on the modern education or the hardcore of the education that is increasing the desire, and so that seems that's mistaken in a way. The Tibetan culture, particularly Tibetan Buddhism, is by contrast is opposite. It says renunciation. The hardcore of Tibetan Buddhism is renunciation. So I was wondering, would the Khangbu still see that renunciation is a part of the Tibetan culture, is necessary, and that idea should be transformed, that it can spread to all over the world, or relatively Tibetans and the influence of this the idea of renunciation materialistically was backward, right, and then socially wasn't developed. And even to the point that today they have trouble to protect their own language and their scripts, and so they are to the very almost like pushed it to the dead end. So that's I think how much this is related to the renunciation, idea of renunciation. My question. You want to translate, or you want me to translate myself?
Oh, please do yourself.
I don't know. But in Chi, what I say to go Tumbanda la Tumbala, or Tona Kawadan. The Somo Maset, the Sonship of the Money,
Las.
We take it on that, and this I don't know because the father of the Saman Suzuki. It's a work which is a mean on that. The Minjungs from the Tao, that we Sosun Rama, it's any second
Yeah, 저런 거 들어가도 역보리스. Yeah.
That's a good question, this question of yours.
근데 살로 땅큰 mambo 요레스.
And there are many people who think like this.
제대 ngala 살로 잠바 요스.
However, I am of a different opinion.
대거르제나 나서들이 야긴로 마타파 화르줄 것도네 야긴 나서 싫당 나서 보바 야기 마리지 리지 만년세 가르제나 밤줄 야기 마리제 고스.
It's not okay. It's not to say that to say that Tibetan has no development or progress at all is not correct. If we're speaking in terms of economic progress or development, this is the one respect you might say this.
되니 가서 밤줄게 질리레제고 내가서 켈린 고스 되니 가서 당럽 그르니 그 돈에 가서 질리레제고 내가 가서 켈린 고스.
If in terms of economic development, we need to admit that we are backward in this respect. In terms of modern culture, we need to also admit that we're backwards in this respect too. However, we are absolutely not backward in all respects. In fact, some of the ideas of our culture are extremely advanced.
And
the value of these ideas are now able to be recognized in the 21st century. And I believe that in the future, the valuation of the esteem of these ideas will only grow. Manang. Yes, but it's true, as you say, that we are inadequate in some respects.
In fact,
in general, that all peoples in the world and all places are progressing or need to progressing is something that is rather obvious. Longkor. Oh yes, okay. 100 or 200 years ago, 1 or 200 years ago, there wasn't even a single car in the West. However, through many years of sustained effort and industriousness, they were able to develop and progress. If we're going to compare the situation with the situation of now with the situation, say, 250 years ago before the Industrial Revolution began, then all people in the world back then were, by today's standards, to be considered backward. However, in terms of scientific technology and all kinds of other ways, great development and progress has taken place.
tarta America parlaya na drama teni jagzena peju jogar teni mambu shongdus.
However, in the course of this development, a great many tragedies have taken place. For example, in America, the relationship between white Americans and black Americans, the plight of Native Americans, etc.
Teni in sarti teni ta te korang so teni yargi pamjur ke yargi mamboz teni tanyoreta yena te pamjur ki yargi ti thola ti lorgi gerum ganangla dan yargi roser ke toni yan damra mambo yakpo yang yore digbo yang yore damra mamboz shondus.
So, despite the fact that the result has been, progress or development in the process of obtaining this development, a great many things have happened, both good and bad.
Teni ngasu ina teni tartari ngasu samlo to korang jevjakshina chokore ina tarta dez ngasu jikting ke tola teni chig to lakser ke tola ina tangrab ke shir ke tola ina chama ke shigz gyamna teni pansum chokpa tomnyambor ina yakpoz res.
So for the time being, if our traditional viewpoints are somewhat put to the side and instead we put more effort on things like economic development, etc., then ultimately we'll be able to achieve a good balance between the two.
But the
fact of people not placing a great deal of importance on the mundane world and worldly affairs is, of course, some legacy of the religious tradition. However, in several hundred years, I believe that there will be a time when we will have improved our level of scientific technology and we'll be able to combine our religious tradition with these other respects in an advantageous way.
Yeah.